How is it going, everyone? I hope you're having an amazing day. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about some of my top picks that I will choose year-round to be throwing at ponds, lakes, wherever I'm at fishing. These are going to be the main worms or soft plastics, whatever you want to call them, that I'm going to be throwing on either a bait caster or a spinning rod. It's all my opinion, but these are the ones that I think are the best for bass fishing. So to start us off, I'm going to be talking about the Magnum Finesse worm. So the Magnum Finesse worm is one of the biggest worms that I'm probably going to be throwing. Like, just look at the size of this thing. It's going to take a pretty big bass to want to commit and eat this full worm. So how I rig this is I will just Texas rig it from the top and then poke it back in, make it weedless, and then normally I'll let that sink down all the way down to the bottom with a bullet weight on it so that it can sink down to the bottom, and then I'll just jig it so that it can go up, and then this tail will kind of come back down. And I don't use this often, but I do like having this in my bag during my trip, just in case. So that is the Magnum trick worm. Next up, the regular trick worm, finesse worm, whatever you want to call it. This is a option that I use more over the Magnum because it is just a little smaller, and that bass is able to get that full worm in its mouth, and you don't have as likely of a chance of losing that fish or having the issue or problem of losing the fish because it doesn't get the full hook in its mouth. This is very similar. I rig it the same way as the Magnum, but this is the better alternative, in my opinion, of the Magnum worm. So moving on to Wacky Worms. This is the Guggen black and blue flake, and I rig this two ways. I'll either have it like this to where both arms are completely free and it can just kind of have this action out here in the sides, or I will Texas rig it to where it's almost like a Guggen dart, and I mainly like rigging it that way, and I seem to get more bites that way other than Wacky. But it also kind of depends on where you're fishing, if you're fishing in very weedy locations or if it's more like rock structures, and it just kind of depends on where you're fishing and where the bass are located that you're trying to fish. But another type of worm that you can do the same way, that is a Wacky worm, is just a 4-inch. This is a 5 or 6 inch, but this is a 4-inch, and this is a different option, and I kind of switch back and forth between the two. Just kind of depends on how I feel or how the bass are eating the lures that day. But that is the Wacky worm. Moving on to worms that I use a lot more than the others. The reason I use these next couple worms is because of the action that the actual worm has. So this is the ribbon-tailed worm, and the ribbon-tailed worm I really like because as it's going through the water, like, I'll Texas rig this and I will normally slow crank it. Like, I'll let it sink after I cast it, and then I will normally slow crank this through the middle water column, and that's mainly when the bass commit and go for it. Because of the ribbon tail at the back, that ribbon tail is just going to be constantly spinning and making that little bit of extra movement that make that bass want to commit, other than just a Wacky worm that it doesn't have as much movement. So that is the ribbon-tailed worm. Next up is the Fluke. Flukes are very reliable baits. I like pretty much Texas rigging it, having the hook come out the top or bottom, however you want to do it. There's many different ways that you can do it, but I like this because it looks very similar to a minnow, and I like that you are able to jerk it right through those weeds to where a bass will think it's a minnow swimming by and think it can easily get a meal and can just easily grab onto it. It's small, has a good profile, and that bass can easily get the full hook in its mouth with this. But there is a other option of the Fluke, but it is a paddle tail. So just like the ribbon-tailed worm, this has that tail that is going to be constantly spinning and having that little bit more action. So I'll like to slow crank this instead of this. I'll normally jerk this. But this one, I like to slow crank this through those weeds or right above those weeds. This seems to work better for me than the Fluke, but it's honestly kind of how the bass are feeling that day and how they're biting your lures. So it's kind of personal preference on that. If it's up to me, I would go for this mainly because of the paddle tail on it. So lastly, of all the worms, I'm going to go with the Bandito bug or the rage tail. These two are very solid baits to throw year round. They can work as trailers. You can fish them at the top of the water column, kind of as like a top water in a way, and these arms are going to be moving just like the ribbon-tailed worm and just like the paddle tail. It has that movement that make those bass want to commit to eating this bait fully. And that's the main key when I'm fishing soft plastics or worms that make me, or that I feel I get more bites with, is having that little bit of extra movement because of those little arms that are just constantly going back and forth like this. You can fish this in 3 ways. I already talked about one of being at the top of the water, kind of like a top water to where that bass sees it at the top. Or the bass is underneath and can see it from the top. The second way is slow cranking it through like the middle water column. That is a very solid way of getting a good bite. And the third is either slow cranking it in those weeds or just letting it sink and then just jerking it, like just being able to have it be in those weeds and then just slowly lift it up and then let it sink down, and those little arms are going to be giving you all that movement that will make that bass want to commit. They make a lot of different types, like this is by Strike King, and this is by, what is it by? It is, well, this one is by Strike King too, but it's called the Rage Tail, and this one's just called like the Rodent, but they make all kinds of different ones, and it's all kind of what you think, but I really enjoy both and think either will do, however you're wanting to throw them, really. Oh, another thing, I like using these as a trailer, like behind a chatterbait or a jig or something like that, just because it has those arms. So those are my top picks that I normally throw year round. I have a lot of faith in these baits, and these are ones that you will see me using throughout the year pretty often. So that is just all my opinion of what I think, but I feel like if you watch any professional angler or anyone that has knowledge about fishing, that they will be using most of these lures as well. That is the video, guys. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.